They say the greatest love stories begin with a spark, but some begin with a collision, a violent clash between an irresistible force and an immovable object. Ryan Stone was the immovable object, a fortress carved from muscle and discipline, haunted by a past failure that had cost him everything. His rules were simple: never engage, never relax, never care. In his world, emotion wasn't a flaw, it was a fatal vulnerability. His suit wasn't clothing, it was armor. Kaelin Ashworth was the force, the brilliant CEO who saw right through the armor, trading on sarcasm to mask her terror. To her, Ryan wasn't a protector, he was a well-tailored robot, a silent jailer in a city of glass. He saw a mission objective. She saw a man desperately trying to outrun his own heart. Their first meeting was a declaration of war. He demanded compliance. She offered mockery. Ryan was prepared for bullets, for sabotage, for infiltration, but he was not prepared for her relentless fire. He thought his fortress was built to withstand an external threat. Then the city outside reminded them how dangerous the world truly was. In a split second, the rules dissolved. Ryan grabbed her, slamming her body against his own heart pounding against the fortress wall he had spent years building. The threat was outside, but the true danger was the unbearable, suffocating intimacy of that moment. He saved her life by breaking every single one of his rules. But as Ryan looked down into her eyes, he knew the terrible, secret truth. The ultimate threat wasn't the enemy hunting his client. It was the terrifying realization that she was his secret weakness, and he had just let her under his guard. Chapter 1. The Fortress and the Flame. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum fashioned from glass and marble, suspended 50 stories above the indifferent roar of the city. Everything in it was expensive, cold, and meticulously curated, a perfect reflection of the woman who owned it, or perhaps the man assigned to protect her. Ryan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, not admiring the panoramic sunset, but mapping the shadows, judging the wind shear, and calculating the sight lines from the neighboring towers. He was a creature of geometry and preparedness. Clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that moved like a second skin, he was an immovable object carved out of discipline. Every movement was efficient, every breath regulated. He was the perfect silent sentinel. Tonight, however, the silence was about to be shattered. The security feed buzzed, announcing the arrival of his principal. Mac. Ryan's voice was a low, gravelly note that rarely saw use. Is she aware of the revised perimeter protocols? She's aware, Ryan. Mac Dillon's voice crackled from the earpiece, laced with professional weariness. Kaelin Ashworth doesn't adhere. She defies. Just focus on keeping the CEO of Ashworth Renewables breathing and away from the unstable elements who dislike her green empire. Remember the rules, Stone. Ryan didn't need the reminder. The rules were the walls of his personal fortress. Rule 1, the principal is a package, not a person. Rule 2, maintain absolute professional distance. Rule 3, never, ever let them under your guard. These rules were stained by the memory of the one time he had broken them, a failure that had cost a life years ago. The elevator doors hissed open, and Kaelin Ashworth stepped into the sterile, expensive air. She was not what Ryan had expected. The public persona was of a high-powered CEO, but the reality was a woman radiating restless energy, dressed in a silk emerald jumpsuit that seemed deliberately defiant against the neutral backdrop of her home. Her hair, the color of rich mahogany, was pulled back, emphasizing eyes that were large, challenging, and a startling shade of green. She looked exhausted, but her chin was tilted in stubborn resistance. She stopped dead 5 feet from him, taking him in with a single, slow, analytical sweep. Well, she said, her voice carrying a cynical amusement. "The rumors didn't do you justice. I was told I was getting a bodyguard. I appear to have received a very tall, expensive shadow who communicates primarily through the flexing of his jawline." Ryan turned, his gaze utterly neutral, meeting her challenge without flicker. "Mr. Stone, ma'am, my communication is sufficient for my duties. I have secured the premises and implemented a level 2 defensive perimeter." "A level 2 perimeter," Kaelin repeated, moving past him to drop a massive, colorful handbag onto a glass console with a crash that seemed scandalous in the quiet space. "That sounds terribly serious. Does it mean I'm not allowed to order pizza? Because I am desperately craving pepperoni." "You are not to receive unsolicited deliveries," Ryan stated, his tone devoid of inflection. "And the movements outlined in your schedule are now vetoed, effective immediately. The charity gala tomorrow night is canceled." Kaelin spun around, her eyes flashing. "Canceled? Absolutely not. That gala is critical to the Phase 3 launch. I will not have my business dictated by some well-tailored robot who thinks he knows better than I do about my own life." "My job is not to dictate your life, Miss Ashworth. It is to preserve it. The recent escalating attempts suggest a professional threat. Your life, and therefore my contract, depends on compliance." "Compliance," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You sound like a firmware update. Let's be perfectly clear, Mr. Stone. You are being paid a ridiculous sum to stop people from trying to hurt me. I'm being paid an even more ridiculous sum to run a multi-billion-dollar company. I will not become a prisoner in my own penthouse because you've created a spreadsheet of doom." There was a tense silence, thick with mutual frustration. Ryan saw a client resisting control. Kaelin saw a jailer hiding behind protocol. Just then, the atmosphere shifted. Not a sound, but a subtle change in the light washing across the glass. Ryan's eyes narrowed, scanning. A faint, rapid thrumming sound began to vibrate through the window panes, too high-pitched to be a helicopter. Ryan didn't hesitate. He covered the 5 feet between them in a controlled rush, slamming his body against her, twisting them both behind a reinforced structural column. "Get down. Stay down," he ordered, his voice low and urgent, pressed directly against her ear. Kaelin gasped, the air knocked out of her lungs. The sudden, violent invasion of her personal space was shocking. She could feel the rigid, unyielding muscle of his chest, the precise, metallic scent of his cologne, and the raw, unmasked focus of professional terror radiating off him. A small drone, no bigger than a dinner plate, slammed hard against the window near where she had been standing, then peeled off and ascended rapidly into the twilight, too fast to track. It wasn't armed, but it carried a sophisticated camera array. It was a clear, aggressive surveillance attempt, a warning shot. Ryan waited 3 long seconds, listening, then slowly released his grip, pulling back just enough to confirm the threat was gone. Kaelin scrambled back, pushing away from him, her breath hitching. Her defiance was gone, replaced by a deep, shaky fear. Her green eyes were wide, reflecting the city lights. What was that?" she whispered, her earlier sarcasm completely incinerated. Ryan stood, his composure immediately rebuilt, although the scent of adrenaline lingered faintly between them. He looked down at her, the mask already clicking back into place. "That, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice flat but possessing a new, unnerving authority, "was them telling you they know exactly where you sleep. And that," he concluded, glancing pointedly at the remains of her silk jumpsuit, slightly rumpled from his protective shove, "is why you adhere to the protocols." He didn't give her a chance to respond. He simply turned and began relaying instructions to Mac, his fortress re-established, but Kaelin was left shivering against the cold marble, realizing that beneath the perfectly tailored suit, her bodyguard was not a robot, but a terrifyingly efficient instrument of survival. She knew then that her life was safe, but her personal peace and perhaps her heart was already under threat. Chapter 2. The Geometry of Laughter. The days that followed were a grueling performance of control versus chaos. Ryan established an unbreakable routine. His shadow never deviated. His vigilance never wavered. Kaelin, equally stubborn, refused to simplify her life, treating his restrictions like minor inconveniences to be navigated. She rescheduled meetings, not canceled them, forcing Ryan to map complex, high-risk routes through the city. The dynamic was a silent, simmering war of wills. Ryan, the fortress, was designed to keep everything out. Kaelin, the flame, was determined to burn her way through his defenses with dry wit and defiant energy. The first crack in the fortress appeared 4 days in. At a sprawling, stifling corporate gala Kaelin absolutely insisted on attending. It was held in a museum's echoic gallery, the polished marble reflecting the hundreds of tuxedo guests like a warped funhouse mirror. Ryan stood slightly behind Kaelin, a pillar of stillness amidst the swirling social currents. His eyes constantly moved, tracking exits, observing waiters, and memorizing faces. His proximity felt like a physical weight to Kaelin, a constant, judgmental presence. Kaelin was forced into a conversation with 2 rival energy executives, a pair of men whose patronizing attitudes were thinly veiled by expensive smiles. She was trapped in a vortex of power plays and insincere flattery. As one of the executives, a stout man named Mr. Harrington, droned on about a perfectly acceptable compromise that would essentially cripple her solar initiative, Kaelin's eyes met Ryan's over Harrington's shoulder. Ryan was entirely focused on a service door 20 feet away, but she saw the slight tension in his shoulders, the professional readiness. She leaned in toward Ryan, keeping a smile plastered on her face for the executives. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice laced with deadly amusement. "Harrington is wearing a watch that appears to have the entire constellation Ursa Major embedded in it. I'm fairly certain it weighs more than my actual car." Ryan didn't react, his face a mask of stone. "And the woman in the emerald gown across the room?" Kaelin tilted her head slightly. "She's drinking champagne with the predatory intensity of a jungle cat spotting a gazelle. I bet she hasn't blinked in 3 minutes." Still nothing. Ryan was a master of non-response. "Okay, new game," Kaelin murmured, a mischievous glint in her green eyes. "I'm going to make the next 3 people I speak to use the word synergy. If I win, you have to tell me what your favorite color is. If I lose, I'll submit a written plan for my pizza orders." A minuscule muscle near Ryan's left eye twitched. It was the only acknowledgement, but for Kaelin, it was a victory. She turned back to the conversation, injecting the word synergistic into her response with predatory precision. Minutes later, as they moved through the crowd, Kaelin was cornered by another group. She was forced to endure a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech from a tech analyst. She leaned against the marble pedestal, exhaustion momentarily breaking her facade. She was sick of the performance. The analyst concluded with a flourish, expecting effusive praise. Kaelin just stared at him blankly. Ryan, perceiving her distress, took one silent step forward, positioning his body as a buffer. "Excuse us," he interjected, his voice unexpectedly smooth and commanding. "Miss Ashworth needs a moment to review her upcoming remarks." He guided Kaelin away by placing a hand lightly on the small of her back, a touch entirely professional, yet the first meaningful physical contact since the drone incident. The warmth of his palm, even through the thin silk of her jumpsuit, was a shock. He reached a secluded alcove near a massive, dimly lit sculpture. Kaelin sank onto a velvet bench, running a hand over her tired eyes. "Thank you," she mumbled, letting her CEO mask fall. I was about 2 seconds from telling him his quarterly report was written entirely in corporate buzzwords and lies. Ryan leaned against the wall, a shadow in the subdued lighting. Restraint is essential, Miss Ashworth. Oh, I know all about restraint, Mr. Stone, she sighed, looking up at him. It's your defining characteristic. But tell me, is it exhausting being perfect all the time? He said nothing, simply meeting her gaze. You know, I watch you, Kaelin said softly, genuinely curious now. You never look away, never lose focus. I bet if a fire alarm went off, you'd have the fastest route mapped out before the smoke clears. You're a fortress, but fortresses are designed to keep things in, too. What are you keeping locked up in there, Ryan? The use of his first name, coupled with the insightful question, struck him like a physical blow. He felt the familiar cold pressure on his chest, the memory of that day surging forward. He immediately retreated behind his professional wall. I'm keeping my focus, Miss Ashworth. My focus is currently on the fact that your 2 o'clock meeting tomorrow is with the man who has direct ties to a known corporate espionage firm. I suggest you retire early. The deflection was brutal and effective, freezing the burgeoning moment of intimacy. Kaelin watched him, her expression shifting from curiosity to frustration. Later, long after Kaelin had gone to bed, Ryan sat in the security command room, monitoring the feeds. The camera showed Kaelin not sleeping, but hunched over her laptop in the living room, surrounded by diagrams and flashing code. Her face was lit by the cold blue glow of the screen, revealing a concentrated intensity that was entirely absent in her public persona. She wasn't just a privileged heiress. She was a brilliant, burdened engineer carrying the weight of her entire company. She looked alone, isolated in her own glass palace. Ryan walked to the kitchen and located the high-end coffee machine. Without allowing himself to analyze the action, he brewed a perfect, strong, dark espresso, precisely the way he'd overheard her order it once. He carried the tiny cup, balanced on a pristine white saucer, into the living room. Kaelin didn't look up immediately. The perimeter is fine, Ryan. Go to bed. It is secured, he confirmed, placing the cup gently on the desk next to her keyboard. But efficiency requires fuel. She finally looked up, her tired green eyes meeting his. She stared at the cup and then at his face, unreadable, yet undeniably offering comfort. A genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips, soft and grateful. A well-tailored robot who makes excellent coffee. My opinion of Level 2 protocols is slightly improved, Mr. Stone. He merely nodded once, the corner of his mouth giving the smallest, fastest upward twitch. It wasn't a smile, not really, but it was the closest he'd come in years. He had successfully delivered the package, and in the process he'd let a sliver of his humanity, a crack, show through the fortress wall. He quickly retreated, the small, dangerous act of kindness already making his self-imposed rules feel terrifyingly fragile. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Rain. The fragile peace established by the shared coffee vanished abruptly the next morning. The delivery arrived disguised as a florist bouquet, addressed simply to Kaelin Ashworth. It was intercepted by Ryan in the ground floor mailroom, per his rigid protocol. The flowers were stunning, expensive, rare, white orchids, but Ryan was never fooled by beauty. He subjected the box to an immediate security scan. Nothing registered. He ripped the packaging apart. Tucked beneath the moss lining was a small, antique silver locket. It wasn't the locket itself, but the chilling familiarity of the engraving on the back that turned the blood in Ryan's veins to ice. A miniature, detailed etching of the corporate logo of Kaelin's father's first startup, a company that had folded 20 years prior. Kaelin's father had used that same discreet logo on personal items, including a tie pin he wore the day he died in a boating accident, a death that was officially ruled accidental
but always whispered about. Only a handful of people knew that symbol. Ryan took the locket upstairs, his face pale and set. Kaelin was on a video conference arguing fiercely with a supplier. When she paused, Ryan simply placed the locket on the mahogany table in front of her. Kaelin picked it up, her brow furrowed. "I didn't order this. It's lovely, but—" She flipped it over and saw the engraving. Her breath hitched, the sudden fear cutting off her voice. "That logo," she whispered, looking up at Ryan, her eyes wide. "No one uses that. Only my father." "Exactly," Ryan confirmed, his voice low and tight. He showed her the analysis on his tablet. The flowers contained traces of a rare, high-security ink, a substance used exclusively by a specialized private intelligence firm that dealt in highly confidential corporate destabilization. "This is not a petty threat, Ms. Ashworth. This is calculated, personal, and suggests that threat is closer than we initially believed and tied directly to your family legacy. They're telling you they know your history. They know where to hurt you." The air in the glass penthouse suddenly felt suffocating. Ryan made a swift executive decision. "The perimeter is compromised. The routine is compromised. We are leaving now." He walked to the window, glancing at the gathering gray storm clouds. "Get a bag. Essentials only. We're going dark." Kaelin didn't argue this time. The locket had done what Ryan's warnings couldn't. Obliterated her defiance. She scrambled to obey, her movements shaky. Within an hour, they were speeding away from the city in a custom armored SUV, driven by an associate with Ryan riding shotgun. The sky had opened up, and the torrential downpour outside created a blurring wall of water. The tension inside the vehicle was almost unbearable, amplified by the confined space. Their destination was a secure, remote safe house owned by Mac's firm, nestled deep in the Catskill Mountains. An isolated cabin built into a fortified structure miles from the nearest paved road. As they drove deeper into the storm, the confinement began to fray Kaelin's already stressed nerves. She looked at Ryan, who was laser-focused on the rearview mirror, his posture rigid. "Ryan, what if this is about the Phase 3 launch? Maybe if I just shut down the public offering for now?" "You won't negotiate with dangerous people, Miss Ashworth." Ryan snapped, his response unusually sharp. "And you won't feel, Mr. Stone," Kaelin shot back, the raw fear turning into anger. "You won't relax, you won't smile, and you won't ever look at me like I'm a person and not a mission objective. You're terrified of attachment, aren't you? Tell me why." The question, driven by the atmosphere of fear, hung heavy in the humid car. Ryan slowly turned his head, his cold, gray eyes meeting hers. The mask he wore seemed to crack, revealing a deep, agonizing pain beneath. "You want to know why I'm a fortress?" Ryan's voice was barely a whisper, strained by years of silence. "Fine. Years ago, I was assigned to protect a family, a prominent CEO and his young daughter. I was closer to them than I should have been. I let the lines blur. I broke the rules." He paused, the memory physically constricting him. "I let myself care about that girl. I started seeing her as family, not a package. It made me hesitate for one critical second when the attack came. I saved the father, but that split second of emotional compromise, that weakness, cost the daughter her life." Kaelin watched him, horrified. She finally understood. His control wasn't about professionalism. It was about self-punishment and survival. His biggest fear wasn't failing to stop a bullet. It was failing because he felt something. "I will not repeat that mistake," Ryan concluded, turning back to the road, his walls rebuilt and higher than ever. "You are the target. I am the shield. That is the geometry of this situation. If I allow myself to see you as anything else, I endanger your life. My discipline is the only thing keeping you alive, Kaelin. Do you understand?" Kaelin leaned back against the seat, absorbing the sheer devastation of his confession. He didn't just guard her, he was guarding himself from the catastrophic potential of his own heart. The rain beat down on the armored roof, isolating them completely. She realized the professional distance wasn't a flaw, it was his secret, devastating weakness. The fear of vulnerability that kept him perpetually safe and utterly alone. When they finally arrived at the secure cabin, a heavy silence descended. The atmosphere of the secluded lodge, warm wood, stone fireplace, but entirely enclosed, was one of imposed intimacy. They were trapped together, two damaged people, one bound by duty, the other by fear, with the torrential rain outside sealing their isolation. The game had changed. They were no longer clients and bodyguard. They were a man running from his past and a woman desperate to save him from it.
Chapter 4. The Unwritten Rule. The safe house was impenetrable, but the silence inside was a constant, gnawing presence. For the next 24 hours, the only sounds were the crackle of the fireplace, the persistent rhythm of the storm outside, and the quiet whir of the cabin's internal security system. Ryan patrolled the small space with restless intensity, his heightened senses perceiving threats that didn't exist. Kaelin tried to work, using the cabin's satellite link, but the chilling realization of the personal nature of the Lockett threat, combined with Ryan's devastating confession, had hollowed out her focus. She watched him from across the room, observing the hard lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He hadn't slept, running on sheer adrenaline and discipline. The weight of his past failure was a tangible thing in the air between them, heavier than the rain. "You know," Kaelin said quietly, setting her laptop aside, "you told me my father's old logo was a calculated move, a psychological attack. What do you think your own rules are, Ryan? They're just another calculated move to protect yourself from pain." He stopped near the stone hearth, facing the fire, refusing to look at her. "They are necessary boundaries. They save lives." "They save yours," she countered, her voice rising slightly. "You think if you don't let anyone matter, you can never fail them again. That's not discipline, Ryan. That's fear masquerading as professionalism." Ryan finally turned, his gaze sharp and wounded. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know what it's like to feel responsible for things that are utterly out of your control." Kaelin pushed herself up from the sofa, the sudden burst of emotion overwhelming her. She walked toward him, her hands trembling. "You built this perfect fortress, but it's a prison, and you are the only inmate. And I hate it, because the man who brought me coffee and worried about my safety is the man I want protecting me, not this cold, terrified shell you put on every morning." The raw confrontation, coupled with the relentless storm and the sheer stress of being hunted, became too much. Kaelin's breath hitched again, but this time it was not defiance. It was a suffocating wave of pure panic. She pressed her hands against her temples, the world tilting. She was trapped. Trapped in the house, trapped by the threats, trapped by the man who refused to see her. She stumbled backward, fighting for air. I can't breathe," she gasped, the room dissolving into indistinct shapes.
The panic attack seized her, violent and complete. Ryan's professional training kicked in instantly. Assess, stabilize, administer. He recognized the signs: hyperventilation, dissociation. He needed to ground her, to bring her back to reality. He crossed the room in 2 purposeful strides, his voice sharp with command. Kaelin, listen to my voice. Focus on me. Name 3 things you see. She was shaking her head violently, tears streaming down her face, trapped in the internal whirlwind. She couldn't focus. In that moment, Ryan's meticulous training failed him. The sight of her raw, agonizing fear, a mirror of the helpless terror he had witnessed in the eyes of that young girl years ago, shattered his control. His professional detachment collapsed into a flood of fierce, protective desperation. His walls came down, not by choice, but by instinct. He didn't just administer aid, he became her anchor. He took her face gently, fiercely in his large, solid hands, forcing her eyes up to meet his. His professional distance was gone. What remained was the vulnerable, terrified man who cared. Kaelin, look at me, he commanded, his voice deep, urgent, and real. You are safe. I have you. You are in the cabin. Look into my eyes. See me. You are safe. You are not alone. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, wiping away the tears. She clung to his voice, his touch, the warmth of his hands a lifeline in the icy grip of panic. Slowly, agonizingly, the terror receded, leaving her weak and trembling. When she could finally breathe, she kept her eyes locked on his. She was close enough to see the devastating self-reproach, the raw, unprotected emotion in his gray eyes. The fortress was open. You broke your rule, Kaelin whispered, her voice husky. I had to, Ryan admitted, his voice strained, still holding her captive with his eyes. You were falling. And you caught me. Not the package, the person. She lifted one trembling hand and tentatively touched the edge of his jaw, the closest she had ever come to his vulnerability. Why, Ryan? Why do you break the rules for me when breaking them nearly destroyed you before? He couldn't answer with words. The air between them was electric, thick with fear, relief, and the overwhelming proximity of their isolation. Everything in him, his code, his past, and his fear of failure screamed danger. But the need to feel, to connect to this defiant, fragile flame in his hands was louder. He lowered his head slowly, deliberately, violating every oath he had ever taken. He didn't rush. He gave her the space to pull away, but she didn't. When his mouth finally found hers, it wasn't a soft, romantic gesture, but a collision. It was desperate, overwhelming, and utterly devastating. A frantic confession of all the emotions he had walled off for years. It was the sound of a heart breaking free from its prison. It was a kiss born of shared trauma, fear, and the undeniable truth of a slow-burn connection finally ignited by the fire of desperation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, the reality of what they had done slamming into them with the cold clarity of a mountain stream. Ryan stared at her, his hands still framing her face. The job was over. The rules were destroyed. He had risked his professional life and her safety for a moment of desperate connection. He knew, with dreadful certainty, that this kiss was the ultimate, fatal secret weakness he could never recover from. The fortress had fallen.
Chapter 5. The New Perimeter. The violation of Rule 2. The kiss hung between them like a physical force. The fortress wasn't just breached, it was rubble. Ryan immediately pulled away, the self-recrimination in his eyes cold and immediate. His professional mind, honed by years of discipline, reasserted control, flooding the space where passion had briefly flared. "That was a mistake," Ryan stated, his voice flat, his gaze shifting away to scan the ceiling, the door, anywhere but her face. "It never happened. We returned to protocol." Kaelin watched him retreat into the shell faster than she thought possible, the denial stinging worse than his earlier aloofness. "Return to protocol? Ryan, you just risked everything, your career, your code, because you couldn't stand to see me scared and alone? You can't unring that bell." He didn't acknowledge the truth of her words. He simply picked up his secure satellite phone and called Mac Dillon, reporting the security breach in the city and their necessary relocation, meticulously omitting the emotional fallout. "Good move, Stone." Mac's voice was heavy with relief. "We've used the window to trace the ink residue from that locket. The source is a disgruntled former executive from Ashworth's earliest competitor, working with a black market data broker. He's planning a physical hit to coincide with her Phase 3 launch date, tomorrow night." Ryan's head snapped up. "Tomorrow? We need to move her, now." The final act of the drama was upon them. Despite the emotional chaos between them, Ryan became the perfect instrument of protection. The threat focused his fear not on attachment, but on action. They left the safe house before dawn, shrouded in professional tension. The confrontation was swift, silent, and decisive, unfolding in the pre-dawn obscurity of a private airstrip where Kaelin was meant to be evacuated. The attacker, anticipating a weary, soft target, was instead met by Ryan Stone, cold, calculating, and fueled by a terrifying focus. As the armed man emerged from the shadows of a hangar, Ryan moved with brutal efficiency. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement, just the blinding speed of a man fighting for the one thing he was terrified to admit he needed to protect. Kaelin, watching from the security vehicle, saw the difference. He was still the fortress, but now he was defending something precious, not just the package. Within 90 seconds, the attacker was neutralized, the threat extinguished. Ryan confirmed the arrest, his breathing even, his suit unrumpled, the gun holstered. The job was done. Kaelin Ashworth was safe. The aftermath was a clinical ending to a dramatic story. Kaelin was returned to her penthouse, the security details were tripled, and Mac Dillon arrived personally to oversee the transition. The contract was complete. Ryan stood in the glass mausoleum one last time, waiting for Mac's final debrief. Kaelin entered the room, no longer shaky, but composed and resolute. "The job is finished, Miss Ashworth," Ryan said, facing her across the expanse of the living room, his voice returning to the flat, formal tone of their first meeting. "I will be filing my final report. I will also be submitting my immediate resignation to Mac." Kaelin's composure faltered slightly. "Resigning? Why?" "Because I failed," Ryan said simply, his gray eyes finally meeting hers, stripped bare of all defense. "I broke the fundamental rules. I violated the distance required, and in doing so, I endangered your life. I cannot continue to guard you when my capacity for professional objectivity is compromised. The secret weakness, my fear of attachment, is no longer my past failure. You are it. You are the one thing I cannot guard myself against, and therefore, I cannot protect you." Kaelin walked toward him, closing the professional distance until they were mere inches apart. "You're wrong, Ryan," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "You think vulnerability makes you weak, but the moment you stopped being the robot and allowed yourself to care, you were unstoppable. You were faster, sharper, and more focused than you ever were before. You saved me because you saw me, not the mission." She reached out and placed her hands on his chest, right over his beating heart. "Your weakness isn't the fear of attachment, it's the fear of being human. And I don't want the perfect bodyguard, Ryan.
I want the man who made me coffee and risked his entire world to anchor me in a storm. Mac Dillon, standing by the elevator doors, watched the exchange, his expression resigned but not surprised. He cleared his throat. Stone, the board is prepared to overlook the contract violations, given the exemplary success of the mission, but you will be reassigned immediately to a long-term, remote, high-security post, effective tomorrow. It was the choice Ryan had dreaded. His career or Kaelin? His fortress or his heart? He looked down at Kaelin, seeing her defiant green eyes, her small hands resting on his chest, and he knew he could never go back to the sterile isolation of his previous life. He took her hands in his, a powerful protective grip that was no longer professional, but possessive. "Tell them I decline, Mac," Ryan said, his voice entirely his own. Deep, resonant, and decisive. "Tell them I'm done with their firm." He turned back to Kaelin, pulling her close. "I can't be your bodyguard. Not anymore. But I can be your perimeter. I can be the wall you stand behind, the one who never leaves. But I'm keeping you close, Kaelin. No more distance. No more rules." Kaelin's eyes welled with relief and love. "No more distance," she agreed, reaching up to kiss him, a kiss of promise, resolution, and undeniable happiness. Months later. The glass penthouse was no longer a mausoleum. It was filled with Kaelin's vibrant art, scattered engineering diagrams, and the comfortable mess of two people finally sharing a life. Ryan didn't go far. He launched his own private boutique security firm specializing in corporate protection, with Kaelin's firm as his first and most important client. They sat on the sofa one evening, sharing takeout pizza. Pepperoni, of course. Kaelin rested her head on his shoulder, utterly relaxed. "You know, Mr. Stone, I still think about that gala. Did you ever decide what your favorite color is?" Ryan shifted, wrapping his arms securely around her waist. He looked out at the city lights, no longer mapping threats, but simply watching the beautiful, chaotic world they shared. "Gray," he finally admitted, his voice low. "It used to be. The color of concrete and steel. But now..." He looked down at the vibrant green of her jumpsuit, the deep green of her eyes, and the hopeful green glow of the city's newest solar installation. "Now I think it's green, the color of life and the color of defiance." He kissed her hair, his touch a silent promise that the fortress was finally and permanently open, having found its true purpose. Not to keep the world out, but to hold the most precious part of it safe inside.